The Whaley House Haunting by Cyrus Cade, freelance investigative reporter. The old typewriter clattered away as I pecked out the final words of my latest story. Another corrupt politician brought to justice, another feather in the cap of Cyrus Cade, freelance investigative reporter extraordinaire. I leaned back in my creaky office chair, savoring the satisfaction of a job well done. But my moment of triumph was short-lived. The shrill ring of the telephone shattered the silence, causing me to nearly topple backwards. I snatched up the receiver, my voice gruff from too many late nights and cheap cigars. "Cade here." "Cyrus, it's me, Tony." The gravel-voiced editor of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, an occasional publisher of my more outlandish stories. "I've got a lead on something big. Real big. You interested?" I perked up immediately. Tony didn't call often, and when he did, it usually meant a story too hot for the mainstream press to touch. "You know me, Tony. I'm always interested. What have you got?" "Ever heard of the Whaley House in San Diego?" I racked my brain, the name tickling something in the back of my mind. "Vaguely. Some kind of historical landmark, right?" "That's right. But it's also known as one of the most haunted houses in America. Been featured on all those ghost hunting shows." I couldn't help but chuckle. "Come on, Tony. You know I don't go in for that supernatural mumbo-jumbo. I deal in facts, hard evidence. Just hear me out, Cade. There's been a string of disappearances linked to the place. Tourists vanishing without a trace. Local cops are baffled. And get this, the current owner is some big-shot real estate developer with connections to City Hall. Word is he's trying to keep it all hush-hush." Now that piqued my interest. Corruption, cover-ups, mysterious disappearances. That was more my speed. "All right, Tony, you've got my attention. What do you need from me?" "I want you to go down there, Cade. Investigate. See what you can dig up. If there's a story, I'll run it. Exclusive rights." I mulled it over for a moment. San Diego was a long way from Minneapolis, and chasing ghosts wasn't exactly my usual beat, but something about this tickled my reporter's instinct. There was more here than met the eye. I was sure of it. "All right, Tony, I'm in, but I'm going to need some expense money up front. And if this turns out to be nothing but a wild goose chase, you're buying me a steak dinner at Murray's when I get back." Tony chuckled. "Deal. I'll wire you the money first thing in the morning." "Good hunting, Cade." I hung up the phone, my mind already racing. I had a feeling this was going to be one hell of a story. The flight to San Diego was uneventful, save for the rather pungent gentleman who insisted on removing his shoes for the duration of the trip. I spent the time poring over the information Tony had sent me, familiarizing myself with the history of the Whaley House. Built in 1857 by Thomas Whaley, the Greek Revival-style mansion had a checkered past from the very beginning. The land it was built on had previously been used as a gallows, where a notorious thief named Yankee Jim had been hanged just a few years earlier. The Whaley family themselves were plagued by tragedy, with infant deaths, suicides, and financial ruin all leaving their mark on the property. But it was the more recent history that intrigued me. Over the past 6 months, 5 tourists had vanished without a trace while visiting the Whaley House. The police investigations had turned up nothing. Current owner, a real estate tycoon named Victor Blackwood, seemed more concerned with keeping the disappearances out of the press than actually solving the mystery. As the plane touched down in sunny San Diego, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something far more sinister than a simple haunted house story. I checked into a cheap motel near Old Town, the historic district where the Whaley House was located. It was late afternoon by the time I made my way to the famous landmark, the California sun beating down mercilessly. The Whaley House stood out among the other buildings in Old Town. Its stark white walls and imposing Greek columns, a stark contrast to the adobe structures surrounding it. A small crowd of tourists milled about outside, snapping photos and listening to a tour guide's spiel about the house's haunted history. I hung back, observing. The tour guide, a perky blonde in her early 20s, seemed to relish in the more gruesome details of the Whaley family's misfortunes. The tourists ate it up, gasping and tittering at all the right moments. As the group filed inside, I approached the ticket booth. The elderly woman manning it eyed me suspiciously as I flashed my press credentials. "I'm Cyrus Cade, investigative reporter. I was hoping to speak with someone in charge about the recent incidents at the Whaley House. Her face hardened immediately. I'm sorry, sir, but we don't discuss such matters with the press. If you'd like to take a tour, I'd be happy to sell you a ticket. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. I was about to press the issue when a smooth voice interrupted from behind me. Now, Mrs. Hendricks, that's no way to treat a member of the Fourth Estate. I turned to find myself face to face with a tall, impeccably dressed man in his 50s. His silver hair was slicked back, and his smile didn't quite reach his cold blue eyes. Victor Blackwood, he said, extending a manicured hand. I own this charming piece of San Diego history, and you must be Mr. Cade. I received a call from your editor earlier today. I shook his hand, noting the firmness of his grip. That's right. I was hoping we could have a chat about the recent disappearances associated with your property. Blackwood's smile never wavered, but I saw something flicker in those icy eyes. Of course. Why don't we step into my office? It's much more comfortable than standing out here in this dreadful heat. He led me around the side of the house to a modern addition that seemed jarringly out of place next to the historic structure. Blackwood's office was all sleek lines and modern art, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Old Town. Please, have a seat, he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his imposing desk. Can I offer you a drink? Scotch, perhaps? I declined politely, pulling out my notepad. Mr. Blackwood, I'll get right to the point. 5 people have vanished while visiting the Whaley House in the past 6 months. The police seem to have no leads, and there's been surprisingly little media coverage of these incidents. Care to comment? Blackwood leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Mr. Cade, I can assure you that we take the safety of our guests very seriously. We've been cooperating fully with the police investigation, and we've implemented additional security measures to ensure nothing like this happens again. And yet, you've made no public statement about these disappearances. Why is that? A flicker of annoyance crossed Blackwood's face, quickly replaced by his practiced smile. We didn't want to cause undue panic. The police advised us to keep things quiet while they conducted their investigation. I'm sure you understand. I jotted down a few notes, my suspicions growing by the minute. Mr. Blackwood, are you aware of any connection between these disappearances and the alleged paranormal activity in the Whaley House? Blackwood's laugh was just a touch too loud, too forced. Mr. Cade, surely a man of your investigative prowess doesn't believe in ghost stories? The Whaley House's haunted reputation is simply part of its charm, a way to attract tourists. Nothing more. I pressed on, undeterred. And yet, eyewitnesses report seeing strange phenomena in the house. Apparitions, unexplained noises, objects moving on their own. Do you have any explanation for these occurrences? Blackwood's smile finally faltered, replaced by a look of cold calculation. Mr. Cade, I think we're done here. I've indulged your questions out of professional courtesy, but I won't sit here and be interrogated about ridiculous ghost stories. If you print any of this nonsense, I can assure you my lawyers will be in touch. He stood abruptly, signaling the end of our interview. As he ushered me out of his office, I couldn't shake the feeling that Victor Blackwood was hiding something big. Back on the street, I mulled over my next move. Blackwood was clearly a dead end, at least for now. I needed to dig deeper, find someone who was willing to talk. As if in answer to my thoughts, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to find the perky tour guide from earlier, her cheerful demeanor replaced by a look of nervous determination. Mr. Cade, I overheard your conversation with Mr. Blackwood. There's something you need to know about the Whaley House, something they don't tell the tourists. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. I'm all ears, miss. Jenny Carlson, can we talk somewhere private? I nodded, leading her to a nearby cafe. Over steaming cups of coffee, Jenny spilled a tale that sent chills down my spine. I've been working at the Whaley House for 3 years now, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. At first, it was just a job. Give tours, tell ghost stories, make some money for college. But then, things started happening. Things I can't explain. I leaned in, my reporter's instincts on high alert. What kind of things, Jenny? She took a shaky breath. It started small. Cold spots in the house where there shouldn't be. The feeling of being watched when I was alone. But then, I saw things. Shadows moving on their own, objects flying across the room, and the voices. Voices? Jenny nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Whispers in the dark, crying children, and sometimes I hear screaming. Terrible, agonized screaming. I jotted down notes furiously, my mind racing. And the disappearances? What do you know about those? Jenny's voice dropped even lower. It always happens the same way. A tourist wanders off from the group, usually in the upstairs bedrooms. We hear a scream, and by the time we get there, they're gone. No trace. It's like they vanish into thin air. And Blackwood? What's his involvement in all this? Jenny glanced around nervously before continuing. He knows more than he's letting on. After each disappearance, he shows up with these. They're not police. I know that much. They go through the house, top to bottom, like they're looking for something. And then, everything goes back to normal, like nothing ever happened. I sat back, processing this flood of information. It was fantastic, unbelievable even, but something in Jenny's eyes told me she was telling the truth, or at least what she believed to be the truth. Jenny, this is big, really big. Are you willing to go on record with this? She hesitated for a moment, then nodded firmly. Yes, people need to know the truth about the Whaley House, whatever it costs me. I spent the rest of the day corroborating Jenny's story, tracking down other employees and former visitors to the Whaley House. While many were reluctant to talk, those who did painted a disturbing picture. Strange occurrences, unexplained phenomena, and a pervasive feeling of dread that seemed to permeate the very walls of the house. As night fell, I found myself standing outside the Whaley House once more. The last tour had long since departed, and the building loomed before me, dark and foreboding in the moonlight. I knew what I had to do. If I wanted to get to the bottom of this story, I needed to see for myself what was happening inside those haunted walls. With a deep breath, I approached the side door Jenny had told me about. A quick bit of lockpicking, a skill I'd picked up in my more misspent youth, and I was inside. The interior of the Whaley House was eerily silent, the antique furnishings casting strange shadows in the dim light of my flashlight. I moved cautiously through the rooms, my senses on high alert for any sign of the paranormal activity Jenny had described. As I ascended the creaking stairs to the second floor, a chill ran down my spine. The air seemed to grow colder with each step, and I could have sworn I heard the faint sound of children's laughter echoing from somewhere above. I reached the landing, my flashlight beams sweeping across the darkened hallway. And that's when I saw it. A figure, pale and translucent, standing at the far end of the hall. It was a woman in Victorian dress, her face a mask of sorrow. My breath caught in my throat as the apparition turned to face me. For a moment our eyes met, and I felt a wave of indescribable sadness wash over me. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the ghostly figure vanished. Heart pounding, I pressed on, determined to uncover the truth behind these supernatural occurrences. I entered what appeared to be a child's bedroom, the air thick with the musty smell of age and decay. As I swept my flashlight across the room, something caught my eye. A small, ornate box sat on a dresser, seeming oddly out of place among the period furnishings. I approached cautiously, my journalistic curiosity overriding my growing sense of unease. Just as I reached for the box, a blood-curdling scream shattered the silence. I whirled around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the room. And there in the corner stood a figure that turned my blood to ice. It was a man, or what had once been a man. His flesh was rotting, hanging in strips from his skeletal frame. Empty eye sockets stared at me with malevolent intent, and as I watched in horror, his jaw opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, inhuman teeth. I stumbled backwards, my mind reeling. This was no ghost, no mere apparition. This was something far more sinister, far more real. The creature lunged forward with inhuman speed, its clawed hands reaching for me. I dodged, barely avoiding its grasp, and bolted for the door. But as I reached the threshold, I felt an icy grip on my ankle. I went down hard, my flashlight skittering across the floor. In the dim light, I could see the monster crawling towards me, its jaw unhinged like a snake preparing to swallow its prey. In that moment of pure terror, my hand closed around something solid, the ornate box from the dresser. Without thinking, I hurled it at the creature's face with all my might. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. As the box shattered against the monster's skull, a blinding light erupted from within. The creature let out an unearthly howl of agony, its form seeming to waver and distort. And then, in a flash of searing light and a deafening thunderclap, both the monster and the remains of the box vanished. I lay there on the floor, gasping for breath, my mind struggling to process what I had just witnessed. As the adrenaline began to fade, I became aware of a commotion downstairs, voices, flashlights, the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs. I managed to pull myself to my feet just as Victor Blackwood burst into the room, flanked by two burly men in dark suits. His face was a mask of fury, and was that fear I saw in his eyes? "You fool," he snarled, advancing on me. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I backed away, my hands raised. "What I've done? What the hell is going on here, Blackwood? What was that thing?" Blackwood's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for something. "Where is it? Where's the box?" "Gone," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It shattered when I threw it at that creature. There was a flash of light, and then nothing." Blackwood's face went pale. No, you've ruined everything." One of the men in suits stepped forward, his hand moving ominously towards his jacket. "Sir, we need to contain this situation," the reporter. Blackwood waved him off, his eyes never leaving me. "It's too late for that now. He's seen too much." He ran a hand through his silver hair, his composure cracking. "I suppose you want answers, Mr. Cade?" I nodded, my reporter's instincts kicking in despite the terror still coursing through my veins. "That would be a good start, yes. What was that thing? And what was in that box?" Blackwood sighed heavily, suddenly looking every bit his age and then some. "That thing, as you so eloquently put it, was a demon. An ancient, malevolent entity that has been bound to this house for over a century." I blinked, sure I had misheard. "A demon? You can't be serious." "Oh, I assure you, Mr. Cade, I am deadly serious." Blackwood's eyes hardened. "The Whaley family didn't just build this house on the site of a gallows. They built it on a nexus of supernatural energy, a thin spot between our world and something else, something dark." He began to pace the room, his words coming faster now. "The demon has been here since the beginning, feeding off the misery and tragedy of the Whaley family, but it was contained, bound by powerful magic to stay within the confines of the house." "And the box?" I pressed, pieces starting to fall into place. "That was part of the binding?" Blackwood nodded grimly. "A vessel, crafted by a powerful medium in the late 1800s. It contained a portion of the demon's essence, keeping it weakened and unable to fully manifest." My mind was reeling, struggling to reconcile what I was hearing with my worldview of hard facts and concrete evidence. "But the disappearances, the tourists, sacrifices," Blackwood said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The demon required regular offerings to maintain its weakened state. I did what was necessary to keep it contained." The full horror of what he was saying hit me like a punch to the gut. "You've been feeding people to that thing? Innocent tourists?" Blackwood's eyes flashed with anger. "You have no idea of the evil we've been holding back. A few lives lost to save countless others. It was a necessary evil." I felt sick, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of what I was hearing. And now, with the box destroyed, fear crept back into Blackwood's eyes. Now the demon is free, unbound, and very, very angry. As if to punctuate his words, an unearthly howl echoed through the house, causing the very foundations to tremble. The lights flickered, and I could have sworn I saw shadows moving of their own accord in the corners of the room. "We need to leave, now." Blackwood's voice was urgent as he gestured to his men. "Evacuate the premises. Initiate Protocol Omega." As the men rushed to comply, Blackwood turned back to me. "Mr. Cade, I strongly suggest you come with us. What's about to be unleashed here? It's beyond your comprehension." I hesitated for a moment, my journalistic instincts warring with my sense of self-preservation. But another bone-chilling shriek from somewhere in the house made up my mind for me. I nodded, following Blackwood and his men as we rushed down the stairs. The scene outside the Whaley House was one of barely controlled chaos. Police cars and unmarked black SUVs were pulling up, their lights casting eerie shadows across the historic facade. Men in suits similar to Blackwood's bodyguards were establishing a perimeter, keeping back a growing crowd of curious onlookers. Blackwood was barking orders into a cell phone, his usual smooth demeanor completely shattered. "I don't care what it takes. Get the containment team here now. We have a Class 5 entity, fully manifested and extremely hostile." I stood there feeling lost and overwhelmed when a hand grabbed my arm. I turned to find Jenny, her face pale with fear. "Mr. Cade, what's happening?" I heard screams, and then all these people showed up. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, a deafening roar split the night air. The ground beneath our feet trembled, and to my horror, I saw cracks beginning to form in the walls of the Whaley house. "It's coming," Blackwood said, his voice filled with dread. "God help us all." The front door of the house exploded outward in a shower of splinters and twisted metal. And there, framed in the doorway, was a sight that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. The demon had grown, its form now a twisted amalgamation of rotting flesh and writhing shadows. Multiple arms, each ending in razor-sharp claws, extended from its massive torso. Its head was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with too many eyes and a maw filled with row upon row of dagger-like teeth. As it stepped out into the night, the air itself seemed to recoil from its presence. Plants withered, concrete cracked, and I could hear screams of terror from the gathered crowd. Blackwood's men opened fire, their weapons blazing in the darkness. But the bullets seemed to have no effect, passing through the demon's form as if it were made of smoke. The creature's eyes, glowing with infernal light, fixed on Blackwood. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of 1,000 tortured souls crying out in agony. "Blackwood, you have failed me. Now, you will suffer." With impossible speed, one of its arms shot out, grabbing Blackwood and lifting him off the ground. The real estate tycoon's screams were cut short as the demon's jaws clamped down, literally tearing him in half. I stood there, paralyzed with terror, as the demon's gaze swept across the assembled humans. Its eyes locked with mine, and in that moment, I felt the full weight of its malevolence and ancient evil. "You," its voice reverberated in my skull, "you freed me. For that, I will grant you a swift death." As the demon lunged towards me, time seemed to slow. I saw Jenny screaming, Blackwood's men firing uselessly, the panicked crowd fleeing in all directions. In that moment, I was certain I was about to die. But then, a blinding light erupted from behind me, so bright it turned night into day. The demon recoiled, shrieking in pain and fury. I turned to see a group of robed figures emerging from one of the black SUVs. They were chanting in a language I didn't recognize, their hands weaving intricate patterns in the air. The demon thrashed and howled as tendrils of golden light began to wrap around its massive form. It fought against the binding, its claws raking furrows in the pavement as it was slowly, inexorably drawn back towards the Whaley house. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and I could feel the air thrumming with power. With a final, earth-shattering roar, the demon was pulled back into the house. There was a flash of light so intense I had to shield my eyes, and then, silence. As my vision cleared, I saw that the Whaley house was intact, looking as it always had. The only signs of the chaos that had just unfolded were the shattered door and the deep gouges in the street. One of the robed figures approached me, lowering his hood to reveal a weathered face with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. "Mr. Cade," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I'm afraid we have much to discuss." And so began the strangest and most terrifying chapter of my life. The story I uncovered in the days and weeks that followed would shake the very foundations of what I thought I knew about the world. The Whaley house, it turned out, was just one of many such nexus points around the globe. Places where the veil between worlds was thin, where ancient evils sought to break through into our reality. And there were those, like the robed figures who had saved us that night, who had dedicated their lives to keeping those evils at bay. I wrote my story, laying out the truth about the Whaley house and the broader supernatural war being waged in the shadows of our world. But as I sat at my typewriter, putting the final touches on the article, I knew that no mainstream publication would ever print it. The truth was simply too fantastic, too terrifying for most to accept. So I filed it away, another unpublished expose in a career full of them. But I couldn't simply walk away. couldn't pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. And that's why, dear reader, I'm sharing this account with you now. As a warning, perhaps, or a call to arms. The world is stranger and more dangerous than you know. The things that go bump in the night are real, and they're hungry. But there are those who stand against the darkness, and now I count myself among them. This is Cyrus Cade, signing off. Stay vigilant, and remember, the truth is out there, even if it's not always fit to print.
Thanks for joining us in the shadows tonight. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories every week. Have you got a story of your own? Share it in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And remember, the darkness holds many secrets. Are you brave enough to uncover them? Until next time, keep your lights on and your doors locked. Sweet nightmares.